بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه وادخلنا في عبادك الصالحين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Today we're going to carry on with the stories of the Sahaba, and we have another superhero, one of the real superheroes that we're supposed to look up to and learn from their stories. And just like subhanallah, if we look at our history and our heritage, we don't need Marvel or any of these superhero characters, because in Islam, in the Islamic history, superheroes come in all shapes and sizes. And today we're going to take another example of an unexpected superhero. And today's talk is about Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu anhu. And Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Masud, his name is Abdullah ibn Masud al-Hudhali, min qabilat Hudayl, which is from the tribe of Hudayl, which is an Arab tribe with no real prominence or significance. They're just an Arab tribe, original Arab tribe that lives near Mecca. Masud al-Hudhali, Abu Abdullah, basically came to Mecca out of need. He needs to trade, he needs to do business, he's struggling. And he formed an alliance with Bani Zuhra. Bani Zuhra are the uncles of the Prophet ﷺ. Amina bint Wahb min Bani Zuhra. So they formed an alliance with them. And back then an alliance basically said, you are under my protection, you're allowed to do certain kinds of jobs, but you have no social class. You can't attend the big meetings, you don't get a vote, you don't get a say. You're allowed to exist within Mecca and do business within Mecca. So that is the family of Abdullah ibn Masud. That's where he grew up. Before Bi'athat al-Rasul Mas'ud al-Hudhali, Abdullah's father, passed away. And Abdullah basically stayed under this hilf. He was still an ally of Banu Zuhra. And he was a shepherd. That was his job. He was a shepherd, he would run errands, and he would be paid in pennies. And his job was shepherding the goats of Uqbah ibn Abu Mu'ayt. And subhanallah, the narrators say that in Mecca the kuffar were split into two main categories. The ones that were against Islam or not Muslims or against the Prophet ﷺ, but they were not enemies. They were not shayateen. They were not Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab. And among those names is Uqbah ibn Abu Mu'ayt. He was one of the staunchest, most filthy enemies of the Prophet ﷺ and Islam. He wouldn't miss an opportunity to insult or hurt or do something like that. And he was the one, if you remember in the seerah, where he dumped the guts of the dead camel on the Prophet ﷺ while he was doing sujood. Another thing about Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, his mother's name, her full name, not a description, was Abd. So her name, since she was a baby, was Abd, and that was her name. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is narrated many times, even by the Prophet ﷺ narrated, Abdullah ibn Abd. That was his kunya. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was named Abdullah. If you read in the seerah and it says Abdullah plainly, that's Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Abdullah ibn Abd. These are the three names that you would find for Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. And his physical stature, he was rather short, very short. It is narrated that if he came around a group of people that were sitting down, you would be mistaking him for somebody sitting between them. So he was very short. Estimates say he's less than 5 feet, even less. Like if you imagine Yoda from Star Wars, something really, really short. He was very skinny, like skin and bones, no muscles. And his beard was patchy, and he had 2 braids. He would tie his hair into 2 braids. And he was also extremely dark-skinned. Shadidul adama, like very, very, very dark-skinned. For for one of the Arab, he was considered extremely dark-skinned. And that's his physical characteristics. Later in his life, he would grow white hairs in his beard, and he would never dye them. He would never color them, with henna or with anything. So even with all of this patchiness and the braids and whatever, he had streaks of white hair in it. And then he developed deep gouges in his face from kathrat al-qiyam, standing up and praying for long nights and crying a lot. And it actually changed his physical face. And it was narrated that one day they were walking with the Prophet ﷺ, and in one narration it says that the Prophet ﷺ ordered Abdullah to get him a miswak. And he climbed a tree to get the miswak, and the wind came and blew his rida and showed his legs. And the Sahaba laughed. And the Prophet ﷺ says, "What are you laughing at?" And they said, "Min humushati saqay, or min diqqati saqay," how skinny. They were like, walking on chopsticks, very, very thin legs. And the Prophet ﷺ, those legs that you're laughing about are heavier in the scale than the mountain of Uhud. If you've ever been to Medina and you saw the mountain of Uhud, it is huge. And the weight of these two legs of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud were heavier than that. So, his story of Islam, he was shepherding outside on the outskirts of Mecca, just like shepherds do. They take the goats, they take them to where the plants are, and he's shepherding. And Rasulullah ﷺ and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh come walking out. They look strained, they're tired, they look thirsty. They basically got fed up of all the abuse of the people in Mecca, and they just went out to the outskirts to catch a breath. And they walk up to Abdullah, and the Prophet ﷺ asks him, he's like, "Do you have any sha murdi'a, a sha that can produce milk?" And Abdullah said, "Yes." He says, "Will you serve us some of the milk?" He says, "No. Ana mu'taman. These are not my sheep. These are the sheep of Uqba, or the goats of Uqba. I cannot give you without his permission." And the Prophet ﷺ, he looks at him and he says, "Do you have a female goat that doesn't have any milk, that is still, hasn't delivered, doesn't have a baby, hasn't produced milk at all?" And Abdullah says, "Yes." He pointed to one. And the Prophet ﷺ grabs it, and he puts his hand on the udder, and he makes dua. And immediately the udder starts inflating, and Abu Bakr scrambles and brings a rock with a little indentation in it. And the Prophet ﷺ milks the goat into this rock, and then he drinks, and he milks again, and he gives to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh, he drinks. And then they save some and they give to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And Abdullah is just sitting there watching. And then after they all drank, the Prophet ﷺ looked at the goat and he said, "Iqlisli." And the udder went back to its original shape right there in front of his eyes. And as a young man, he hadn't even reached puberty, so he was between 10 and 13 years old, sitting there, and he's like, I was, what is this? What kind of magic, sorcery, what is this stuff? So he goes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, "Allimni mimma taqul." Teach me, what are you saying? What are these words? And the Prophet ﷺ, out of his mercy and out of his kindness, he puts his hand on his head and brushes his head, and he says, "Innaka la ghulamun mu'allam." You are a young man that is knowledgeable and seeks knowledge, which is, these days, people are expected to seek knowledge. Back then, this is a shepherd. He will never reach social stature. He will never need this knowledge. He will never need to read and write. So to be an exception and to seek knowledge and to be impressed and to ask was something outstanding, and the Prophet ﷺ saw this as outstanding. A few days later, he comes to the Prophet ﷺ, gives him bay'ah and gives the shahada, and immediately drops the work of shepherding, and he says, "I am with you, I'm your servant." So he becomes the servant of the Prophet ﷺ. He becomes like his shadow. Wherever the Prophet goes, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is behind him. And he narrates himself, he says, "I remember a day where I was the sixth of all Muslims on earth. So, and he was very proud to be the sixth Muslim on earth. Again, the narrations are different in terms of, was he the sixth man? Was he total of six? It doesn't, the narrations aren't 100% sure, but he used to, boast about that a lot, that there was a day where there was 6 Muslims on all of earth, and he was among them. Radiallahu anhu. Later in Mecca, the Sahaba, they're meeting in Dar al-Arqam. People are hiding their iman. People are avoiding coming out of their houses, the Muslims, because of the persecution. And they gather one day with the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, and they say, is there among us a man who can go and read Quran? Let Quraysh listen to it. Let Quraysh hear it. They've never heard the Quran. They heard it from the Prophet ﷺ, but immediately, Abu Jahl will stand behind the Prophet ﷺ, make noise and prevent him from delivering. Is there a man among us who can do this? Abdullah ibn Masud stands up and he says, I'm for it. The Sahaba are like, you're not from Quraysh, you don't have power, you're not wealthy, you're tiny, they're going to kill you. And Abdullah asks the Prophet, and the Prophet ﷺ gives him permission. And he goes, he waits for Dhurwa, where all of the Quraysh have gone all the way, done their morning work and whatever, and then they come to their nawadi, to their little clubs or gatherings around the Kaaba. And Abdullah stands and he says, A'udhu billahi min shaitan rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim, Ar-Rahman. And he starts reading Surah Ar-Rahman. Now, this shows you an early understanding of Quran for Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, because Ar-Rahman, this was a controversial name of Allah to Quraysh. Quraysh didn't believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was Ar-Rahman. They're like, we know Allah, who is this Rahman? So when he comes and he starts reciting Ar-Rahman, they're like, what is this shepherd? Who's this nobody? What is he saying? And then they listen in, they're like, he's repeating what Muhammad says, alayhi salatu wasalam. And they walk up to him and they start beating him. And they start beating him until he falls unconscious. And he's all bloodied, and they carry him and they revive him, and he wakes up. And they're like, this is exactly what we told you would happen. They almost killed you. Are you happy now? Why did you do this? He says, Alhamdulillah, they are less significant in my eye after the beating. Wallahi, I'm ready to go do it tomorrow morning, same thing. And they said, Hasbuk, that you did enough. Quraysh has heard the Quran and they hated it. So you did the task that you were set out to do. His conversion to Islam was ignored, and he was belittled, and his existence didn't really matter to Quraysh. Similarly, to other Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, where they were tortured for sport. Really, they didn't matter if they were Muslim or not. They were just tortured and persecuted for sport more than anything. And at one point before the Hijrah, the A'yan, some of the honorable in Jahiliyyah characters of Quraysh came to the Prophet ﷺ. They're like, Muhammad, we will sit with you, but you have to get rid of these lowlifes, these people that we won't be seen with public, these shepherds and these slaves, these freed slaves. We don't want to be seen with them. We can't sit with them. Kick them out of your audience, and we will come and we will talk to you, and we'll discuss what your message is and what you have to deliver. And what's his name? Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, he mentioned some names. And the first name he mentioned was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He's like, throw him out. Bilal ibn Rabah, throw him out. Suhaib al-Rumi, throw him out. Al-Khabbab ibn al-Arat, throw him out. And they basically named individuals. They're like, if you throw him out, tard, they use the word tard, then we will come and sit and talk to you. And some of the Sahaba came to the Prophet and they're like, this is an opportunity. Even just tell them to leave for just a little bit. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed in the Quran, in Surah Al-An'am, was it? وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم بِالْغَدَاةِ. So Al-An'am ayah 52, وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ ما عليك من حسابهم من شيء وما من حسابك عليهم من شيء فتطردهم فتكون من الظالمين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed that do not throw out these that remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the morning and in the evening, who seek favor with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who seek the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have nothing of their judgment upon you, and none of your judgment is upon them. And if you throw them out, you'll be one of the transgressors. And this is, this is part of religion. During Salat al-Isha, the Imam was reading about Surah Nuh. Same thing. The honorable came and they're like, get rid of these people, these aradhil, these nobodies, get rid of them so we can believe, or we can come and discuss with you. And it's a rule that there is no compromise. Religion, belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, makes all humans equal except in taqwa or in connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was a rule that the Prophet ﷺ withheld and the Sahaba behind him upheld as well. He's also, again, if you want to talk about superheroes, we say بعض المناقب, some of the characteristics of the Sahaba. They say, oh, this person ذو الهجرتين, they did 2 hijras. They went to Habasha and Al-Madinah. Or they say من البدريين, these are the people who attended Badr. Or they say من أصحاب الشجرة, the ones who attended Al-Hudaybiyah. So all of these great events in Islam, the Sahaba will say, I was there, I was at this event, I was at that event. Abdullah ibn Masud was everywhere. Every single battle, he was there. Every single hijrah, he was there. Every outing where the Prophet ﷺ, he was there. And that's an honor very, very few Sahaba had. And because he was so close to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was in true service to Allah, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger. Okay. Yeah, battery's dying. So he was in true service to the Prophet ﷺ, that he was known, his nicknames, ذو النعلين or صاحب النعلين, because wherever the Prophet ﷺ went in, the Prophet ﷺ would take off his na'al, his shoes, and he would walk into the house or the majlis or the masjid. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was behind him. He would pick up the shoes and put them under his armpit and wait, sit next to the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ was about to leave, he would take the shoes, put them under the feet of the Prophet ﷺ, and he would wear them. He was also known as Sahibu Siwak, Sahibu Siwaki Rasulullah. He had the miswak of the Prophet ﷺ. Wherever the Prophet ﷺ went, a miswak, you could put it in a pocket. But Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he's like, no, it's my honor to hold this miswak for the Prophet ﷺ. And whenever the Prophet ﷺ wanted to do siwak, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was there, readying it, making sure it's clean, it's cut, it's fresh, and he would hand it to the Prophet ﷺ. And he also did this with the asa, the stick of the walking stick of the Prophet. He did it with when they're traveling, he would carry the pillow or the bedding of the Prophet ﷺ, Dhul Wisada. He would carry it with him wherever he went. And he was also known as Saqi Rasulullah. He would carry a jug of water. If the Prophet ﷺ needs to do wudu, needs to drink, needs to relieve himself or whatever, he was there. If the Prophet ﷺ wanted to bathe, he would hold the rida and cover the Prophet ﷺ. If the Prophet ﷺ went to al-khala, he would stand and make sure nobody went and came close to him. So he was like the shadow of the Prophet. And to the point that Rasulullah ﷺ told him, you alone can come into my house, to the hujurat, without permission. You don't have to seek permission. Just open the curtain and walk through. And you are allowed to listen in to my private conversations until I tell you need to leave. So he was, the Prophet ﷺ finishes prayer and then he goes to his hujurat. He was with him, he walks in. The Prophet ﷺ comes out of the hujurat to make prayer. He's behind him or in front of him. It depends on the situation. So he was so close to the Prophet ﷺ that even some of the Sahaba especially the new ones, like Abu Musa al-Ash'ari radiallahu anhu, when he came, he said, we watched Abdullah ibn Mas'ud so close to the Prophet ﷺ, we thought he was actually from among his household. They thought he was his son, his adopted son, his something, because he was so close and there was no khalafa, no barriers between him and the Prophet ﷺ. And being this close to the Prophet ﷺ, one of the honorable things that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud talks about, he says, I took directly from the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ bid'un wa sab'ina surah. More than half of the Quran, he took directly from the revelation to the Prophet, from the Prophet directly to him. So when he was reciting, the Prophet ﷺ was there to correct for him. More than 70 surahs. And his recitation was mashhud, like the Prophet ﷺ multiple times would say, if you want to hear the Quran as pure and as beautiful as it was revealed upon me, then listen to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And then in a different hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, if you were to listen, or if you were to learn the Quran, and he named 4 people, and one of them was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And one day, the Prophet ﷺ was sitting with Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and he asked him, read the Quran upon me. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud starts reading Surah An-Nisa. And he reads and reads and reads until he reaches the ayah number 41, where he says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فكيف إذا جئنا من كل أمة بشهيد وجئنا بك على هؤلاء شهيدا. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Hasbuk, stop. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud looks up, and the Prophet ﷺ is tearing. So that ayah moved the Prophet ﷺ. What would it do to us? What should it do to us? ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ was moved by the recitation. I mean, he received it from Jibreel, and he was moved by the recitation of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. Later, in a different story, after Hijrah in Medina, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was standing praying in the masjid, and the Prophet ﷺ was with Abu Bakr, and he was with Umar ibn al-Khattab walking, and they hear somebody reading Quran. And they walk up to the masjid, and it's dark, and Abdullah is praying, and Abdullah is reading again Surah An-Nisa. And he reads 100 ayah, does ruku', comes up, and he starts making dua. And the Prophet ﷺ is standing between Abu Bakr and Umar, and he's saying, Sal tu'ta, sal tu'ta. Whatever you ask, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give it to you. And this is the Prophet ﷺ, giving shahada that this dua that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is giving is going to be answered, and he will get what he asked for. So they leave him and they go home. The next day, Umar ibn Khattab is like, I'm going to go tell Abdullah. I'm going to get the ajr of making my brother happy. He runs straight to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, knocks on his door. He's like, oh Abdullah, last night this and this happened. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Sal tu'ta, what was your dua? He says, I just told Abu Bakr. and Umar ibn Khattab said that, subhanallah, Abu Bakr I will never beat him. He's always ahead of me in good deeds. So he basically came second. And part of the dua that he said, he asked for a strong iman that doesn't change, and he asked for the sahbah of the Prophet ﷺ in the highest levels of Jannah. And this is the dua that the Prophet ﷺ told him that this will be answered. Whatever you ask will be answered. And later, after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he was in Medina under Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and he would go to the different battles. He went to Al-Yarmouk, he went to help in Fath al-Sham, and then he was commissioned to Al-Kufa. When Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu created the city of Kufa in Iraq, he was made the wazir. A wazir means he's the teacher of the people, he's the faqih of the people, and he's the judge. So he was sent with Ammar ibn Yasir. And Umar ibn Khattab, in the letter that he commissioned them to Ahlul Kufa, he said, I sent to you Ammar ibn Yasir wa Abdullah ibn Mas'ud as the wazir, and they are from the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ, from the people of Badr. Follow them, listen to them, and obey what they say. And I've given you Abdullah, although I would want him for myself. I'm honoring you with Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud stays in Al-Kufa and establishes the first Islamic learning academy, the first learning academy in the area. And he has his students and he's teaching them. And in the age of Umar ibn al-Khattab was in Hajj, and a man from Kufa came and he says, oh Umar, there's a man in Kufa that narrates the Quran from his mind. He doesn't read the Quran from a book and people are copying. No, he's reading it from his tongue. And Umar ibn al-Khattab gets angry. He's like, who dares do this? Who dares trust his memory enough to let people write the Quran from his mind? And the man is like, oh, it's Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And Umar ibn al-Khattab was like, yeah, okay, no worries. It's Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He's the most knowledgeable person in the Quran who's alive. So later, when Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anh burns all of the masahif and sends the golden copy basically to the different amsar, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was offended. He's like, I've been writing these masahif for years, and my students have been writing them for years. Now you're asking me to destroy them? I'm more knowledgeable in the Quran than the writers of the Quran that wrote it in Medina. And he's like, I'm going to hide my Quran, سأغله. And in the Quran there's an ayah which means that if you hide something from the deen, you will bring it with you on the day of Qiyamah. He's like, I want to come on the day of Qiyamah with this Quran that I wrote with my own hands as something that I hid. So he was extremely knowledgeable. Later Uthman ibn Affan asks him to come back to Medina, and he uses him in fitya, and he uses him as a judge. And after a few years, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud gets ill, and he's on his deathbed. And then Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anh came to him, and he asks him, what are you complaining about? What ails you? He says, what ails me are my sins. He says, what do you desire? What can I get you? He says, I desire the mercy and forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Uthman ibn Affan says, ask me anything so I can leave for your family, any money or whatever. He says, money will not give them anything. I left them with the Quran in their chests, and that is enough sustenance for them. Some of the sayings of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, again, he was described by the other Sahaba as the closest in behavior and manners to the Prophet ﷺ. Even his wordings sometimes sound close to what the Prophet ﷺ would say, but they're not a hadith, they are the words of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. One day he was in Mecca, and he went up the Safa mountain, and he was yelling, announcing to the people, but he was talking to himself. He says, oh you tongue, and he grabs his tongue. Say good, you will be rewarded, and be quiet against evil before you are sorry and you regret it. Because I have heard the Prophet ﷺ say, most of the sins of the son of Adam are by his tongue. And so Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was a teacher. He was an expert in the Quran, and he said about himself, he said, I took 72 surahs from the Prophet ﷺ. There isn't a man that I know on this earth that knows more about the Quran than I do. And there isn't a surah that was revealed except I know when it was revealed and why it was revealed. But I'm no better than my ashab. So he wasn't bragging, but he says this is the level of my knowledge. And if there was anybody on this earth that is more knowledgeable than me, and a camel would get me there, I would ride to him to learn from him. So he was both honoring himself with the knowledge that he gathered and he spent learning from the Prophet ﷺ, but at the same time humble enough to say, if somebody has knowledge, I'm willing to go seek it. Just to summarize, most of the people read on qira'at Hafs, right? Hafs an Asim, right? This is the most common narration. Hafs an Asim, an Ibn Hubaysh, an Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So over 80% of the Muslims today that read the Quran read on a narration from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. From his school, after 2 generations from Al-Kufa, one of the greatest madhahib was, one of the greatest ulama, Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man, was one of the students of the students of the students of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. In the books of hadith, there's about 840 hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and about 50 or 60 of them are in the Sahih Muslim or Sahih al-Bukhari. So he was, an ocean of knowledge, radiyallahu anhu. And one of the things, one of the biggest things that kind of moved me about him was he worked hard. He worked super hard to be close to the Prophet ﷺ. He worked super hard to gain this knowledge, and he worked super hard to share and disseminate this knowledge. And this is, one of the manaqib of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum is whenever they got an opportunity to do something, they always stepped up and did it. So, one important final thing, I promise. One important thing that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud did was at the Battle of Uhud. You remember a few weeks ago we talked about Mu'adh and Mu'awwadh, who struck Abu Jahl. One cut his leg and the other one struck him in his chest, and Abu Jahl fell, but he didn't die. After the Battle of Uhud, the Prophet Battle of Badr, after the Battle of Badr, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Go find him. I didn't see him leave, and I didn't see his body. Find him. Abdullah, go find him." And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud goes finds him, and he's in the throes of death. He's still alive, breathing, but he's gone. There's no way anybody would recover from these wounds. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud walks up to him and he puts his foot on his chest. Imagine a person that's not even 5 feet tall putting his foot on the chest of Fir'aun al-Ummah. He was huge, he was strong, he was the most honored by Quraysh. So he steps on his chest and grabs his beard and cuts his head off, kills him. And he goes to the Prophet ﷺ and tells him, Abu Jahl is dead. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Mata Fir'aun al-Ummah. The Pharaoh of Quraysh is dead. And this is an honor that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was given, being of such small stature, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored him with the Quran, honored him by defending the Prophet ﷺ, and honored him by taking out the Fir'aun of Quraysh. So the final point, Saturday inshallah, is Yawm Arafah. None of us knows when we raise our hands in dua on the day of Arafah if there's an angel saying Sal tu'ta. Imagine making that dua on that day at that hour, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that your dua has been accepted. Take this opportunity, use the opportunity. Don't let the day of Arafah pass you by in preparation for Eid or cleaning the house or whatever it is. Take some time, dedicate it to dua and remembrance of Allah on this day. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us to what He loves and accepts. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from us the best of our deeds, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for any of our shortcomings. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Barakallahu feekum.